I think the thing that Brian didn't mention that you all need to know is I live in Hobart and I got up at 4:30 this morning to join you. So if I drop off while I'm talking, you know why. I can't read, so I'm going to have to put some glasses on. I guess the first thing that I want to say before I actually start going into the slides that I've prepared to give you a talk is that the standards that you're dealing with from the Victorian government are the beginning. This is not going to go away. One of the issues that we know from reading the research in schools is that there's been much debate over many decades about what the role of schools is and how far they should go and where they should sit and what they should do outside of core curricula. At the end of the day, I think certainly the Victorian inquiry was the beginner, but the Royal Commission, which is still going, has revealed an enormous amount to us. And one of the critical issues as well is that it's also differentiated in some ways, and I'm happy when we have question times to talk about this, about some of the critical issues in faith-based schools versus, if you like, public schools that aren't built around a religious faith base. And certainly the Royal Commission has been looking at that, and there's some very honest discussion about why particular problems have occurred in some of the faith-based schools. Most obviously, gloriously, I can say the Catholic schools. And one of the issues that we obviously have there as well are the continuation of looking at the culture of the Catholic Church as it runs organisations. And I mean, there's many, and I'm happy again to talk about these if people want to talk about them later. There's been many research reports, that in fact the various popes have got expert reports that have talked about the need to normalise the role of the clergy in the Catholic system by marriage and relationships and whatever. However, we've also seen this sort of abuse in other schools such as the Anglican schools. But it's not just the schools, we've seen it in the YMCA, we've seen it in the you name it, it's there. So this is going to keep coming, and I believe that the federal government will be looking at compliance issues around this. The Victorian government just happened to be the first government to jump off in terms of basically imposing standards on the education system. So what I am doing, and I heard Brian, and it stuck in my mind, he said, many of you will say you've heard this all before. Well, I guess one of the things is that this is a really easy thing to hear and let go past. People let it go past because they don't think it's relevant. People let it go past because it is too painful and too challenging. If I look around this room, we know that 1 in 6 females under 18 in Australia has experienced, 1 in 4 females and 1 in 6 males has experienced some sort of violence. So if you look through this room and just cut off that proportion, 1/6 of the room, 1/4 of the room. Now, whether that's been a direct experience or whether it's been a peer or a good friend that you've supported through that process, there is a lot of hurt, pain and shame in this area. So part of the learning in this area is to begin to be able to talk in a language which acknowledges what the issue is. And in fact, if we talk to children and young people about how they experienced sexual abuse or other forms of abuse, but primarily I will talk about sexual abuse because that's where most of the research has been, what we hear is that they actually feel that adults feel incredibly uncomfortable, that they can't in fact form a common language with them to discuss these things, and they don't know how to follow up. So I guess what I'm saying to you is I think all of you are now going to be engaging in this issue in an environment of compliance. I think that's the bad news, that's because compliance is never a nice thing to have to deal with. But I think the good news is that at people's hearts, I think we're utterly horrified to think about the price for the children of Australia if we continue to let this happen. And so it's actually how do we raise as a community with our various organisations to change it. So I think I can start now, if you don't mind. I'm just going to have to try and work out the technology. You hit the arrow and it works, Brian? Good, righto. And I'll strip off the gear, I'll get into working clothes. So what we're going to be doing is this session before morning tea, I'm going to generally talk to you about what child abuse is, about what the various different bodies are, things that are happening, some of the issues around that. I'm probably going to start trying a little bit of gentle desensitisation by talking to you about some of the realities of the sorts of things when you start talking about this sort of abuse in school. And probably get to the break time with that behind us. When I come back after break, I want to talk to you about some Queensland research that's been done into teachers and why they do or do not, within their schools, respond to the issue of abuse. The other thing is that because of the child safe approach, you are only in fact dealing with part of the issue. So I want to talk to you about what the bigger issue is, because my belief is that within 20 years, the way that we talk about child safe organisations and safety in schools will be part of a much bigger picture where we're looking generally at child protection, domestic violence, sexual violence in relationships and a whole range of things. And I think that they're all the things that all of you as teachers would be living with on a day-to-day basis, but actually probably haven't got the avenues to respond to, and also may not have the personal tools to respond to. So, what is abuse? Essentially, it involves 4 different things. Physical abuse, and that's probably the most obvious. And interestingly enough, when I come back to the research after break, physical abuse is the one that teachers feel most comfortable with. Terrible thought, you actually feel comfortable with physical abuse, but you can see the bruises, you can pick up neglect pretty well too, because the kid's coming to school hungry, the hair's unwashed, they're dirty, they might be sick and they're not being managed. So they're the traditional ones, and they're the ones that we have dealt with in child protection. And we need to separate out what child protection is versus child safe. So child protection, and the way that I will use that term, is about the mechanism within governments, and they're in every state, which are actually responsible for investigating whether abuse has occurred and where there are powers to remove children from families or to require certain behaviours. Most of the child protection systems also run foster care systems as well, so that's all child protection. Child safe is in fact about detection and notification to child protection that there are children who may be experiencing risk or whatever else. And so one of the issues that we have, and I'll come to it in a little while, is people who have had a lot of experience with child protection, many of their experiences have been quite negative. And teachers on the whole do not think reporting children to child protection is a fabulous thing to do. So one of the things that I often call this is the Sophie's choice. So many people in operationalising decisions in this area actually make their choices between a bad option and a worse option. And that is a really, really hard thing. And I think it's actually those sorts of systems failures in child protection, and I think the perceived inadequacy of the services that have in fact led to a lot of people actually making decisions not to push children into that direction. Obviously different states have different levels of mandation in reporting. In the state I come from, any suspected child abuse, you are mandated to report, and the legislation defines by profession. So my professional training is as a social worker, yours as teachers, all of you, if you even suspect it, you have to report. That has major problems in it as well, because what happens is that we all risk manage so that we report everything, every time, and the whole system gets deluged. So at the moment what's happening is that the whole child protection system in Australia is pretty much on its knees, different states for different reasons. Yours is no different to anybody else's, and they're sitting there, but you will in future have a much closer relationship, I'd imagine, with child protection than you've previously had. And one of the things I'd be interested in hearing from you when we get some feedback at the end of the session is the degree to which your schools have established formal relationships with your child protection organisations and have established the opportunity, if you like, to collaboratively case manage and work with children who are straddling that system. Similarly so, the foster parents, and I imagine that a number of you have got children that are in foster care at your schools, and to what degree has the school formalised relationships with foster parents to help them in the role with those children. But the other thing that we should remember as well is that children who have been caught up in the child protection system are much more likely to become victims of sexual abuse in their life. There's a whole range of reasons for that. But one of the things that we've actually got to do is to see that children in the child protection system have a whole lot of risk factors that they're carrying with them. And again, it's not an area I'm going to go into in great depth today, but it is something that you need to understand. And part of that may be about intrapsychic vulnerabilities that the child already has. It may be about lesser levels of parental support and assistance. It may, and when I just skip back the intrapsychic stuff, and I was listening to the conversation earlier, I'd be interested in your 4 causes for disruptive behaviour, because the service that I ran, Sexual Assault Services, we did all the back-end work behind child protection of work and all of our schools, our public education schools, in trying to help children who'd been sexually violated to recover a state of well-being. And within the schools, what happens is the children basically display trauma behaviour, and that has 2 basic ways of going, which is that they either go over the top and they get labels like hyperactive, ADHD, and a whole range of things attached to them, or they completely withdraw. So children who have unresolved trauma are like that, and children in the child protection system carry unresolved trauma almost like a backpack. So we also, as I said, those physical abuse and neglect are the traditional ones we know. Psychological abuse is interesting. It's the bullying, the threatening language, the shaming, and the intentional ignoring and isolation. It's been quite interesting. One of my earlier lives, when I was an academic, one of my study areas was actually gender culture, and girls use power. Not surprising, I'm sure most of the men in the room know that women use power. They use it quite differently to the way that men use power. Men tend to, the very quick ways they call it dominance and subordination. When women use power, it's inclusion and exclusion. And what we're having revealed at the moment across schools and across, particularly with the use of electronic media, is the use of those sorts of power, social isolation as a form of punishment and, if you like, externalising. We're seeing very high rates of childhood suicide attached to them. So one of the things that we're beginning to see coming out of, I guess, the mental health movement and what's going on with children and young people is the beginning of that understanding of the etiology of that, and beginning to see that as neglect. And one of the issues is because schools are the place where young people in particular socialise with other young people, that's often where it's identifiable, and so following up on those things is also another area. So the psychological abuse is also another thing that comes from, which is, again, in Victoria has taken it to the fore with the Rosie Batty matter, is domestic violence. And for many children who are living in homes where where their parents are involved in battery, the children may not in fact be physically assaulted in any way, form or means, but the level of the trauma impact of the children seeing their trusted adults constantly involved in physical violence is quite extraordinary. And we know now, I should have said I'm an ex-academic, so I tend to jump around all sorts of bits of research. But we certainly know that children that growing up in homes where there is domestic violence have, again, a weighted trajectory into being violent adults, both sexually violent and also physically violent. So one of the things that we also haven't picked up in terms of looking at children is if there's domestic violence going on at home, then the child may well be experiencing a trauma response. And that's been quite interesting because we've actually got in our state a big thing happening at the moment because in our state, Tasmania, the legislation allows the principal to decide what to do with a disruptive student. And it's an individual choice, but a significant number of the principals have been using school exclusion of the child as the means of managing outrageous behaviour in the class. And what we are increasingly identifying is if there has been violence in the family home, what you're really doing is immersing them back in that. What happens is the school principals very justifiably talk about the danger that child might provide to other children and the teaching staff, but we're actually looking at those unresolved trauma and what happens in school policies. Is this interesting you, or is it all going, I'm way outside, I'm not a teacher, so I'm coming in from all of those places, but I think it's important for you to begin to understand these interrelationships and the streams of research that are going on in this field, because they are what's going to be pushing both state and federal government policy to look at how we deal with these things. And I think the ideas of school focusing just on curriculum and what's kids' academic attainment about is actually going to change markedly, because if a child, for instance, is experiencing unresolved trauma, their capacity to have any sort of attention span in a classroom is somewhere between zilch and a little bit, but it's certainly not sufficient to actually allow them to achieve, and particularly if they've also had a disruption of their attachment, which they can depending on the nature of the abuse, then in fact they are often held, if you like, at a particular emotional, mental age or stage. So the child might be 12 but operating at the level of a 7-year-old and finding classroom settings very frustrating. And this comes out of obviously the abuse of the child themselves, but it can come out of a child coming to school from a home where there is violence. So one of the first things that I go when I go near a school is to say, do you actually know if there's any family violence orders operating in relation to this family? And if so, what are you doing about actually looking at the impact on the child about the fact that there is violence at home? So the children who are experiencing violence at home bring it into the schools. One of the things that's happening at the moment with the child safe standards is that you are not being asked to deal with violence in the home. You are being asked to deal with children who are directly subject to violence, but I guess what I'm signalling to you is I think that that's going to be a step along the pathway to that much larger picture, which is where we're going to be going. I should have also warned you, I tend to talk in 20 years rather than 3 years. I've given up working for governments. It was one of the most frustrating things because you had to do everything within the next couple of years. But I'm much more interested in how do we actually get a less violent community? How do we get less violent families? So I think I've just gone through that. The children develop attachment issues and trauma-related responses. I wanted to just sort of say, if we don't pick up, and this is specifically about sexual abuse, as I said, it's the area where there's most research, but if we don't pick up childhood sexual abuse, then the loads, both emotional, maturational, life achievement that people carry through into the rest of their lives are quite extraordinary. So both women and men who've been subjected to childhood sexual abuse report higher rates of suicidality than the general population. At the moment, the figures in Australia, something like 70% of the adult women in the mental health system have experienced sexual abuse at some stage of their life. It's a clear pathway and trajectory into mental health issues and coping issues in life. And evidence suggests that men have been sexually abused in childhood, particularly vulnerable to suicide. I mean, one of the things we're grappling with in Australia is the high suicide rate among men, and they're reporting suicidal ideation at 10 times the rate of the general sample of the community. 46% of men who have been sexually abused as child have actually identified that they have contemplated suicide at some stage of their life. So the critical issue of identifying children who are at risk, who have experienced some sort of violence or trauma is quite crucial. And the reality of it is children spend an enormous amount of time at school, plus you are trained to work with and understand the developmental issues of children. So it's just putting those right processes into place so that you feel like you can use that information to take things through. So what are the characteristics? As I said, at the moment, I'm not going to be talking a lot about the child protection stuff, other than the fact of how you as teachers feel about it and why you don't want to necessarily use it. I'm going to talk about child safe because that's what is facing you, but they all link together, and the reality of it is the child safe strategies will lead you into a direct contact with child protection. The worst state, I think, at the moment in child protection is South Australia, where they actually found that a number of the senior carers in the actual child protection system were themselves sexual abusers. And so at the moment the whole South Australian system is being pulled apart. The Tasmanian system is being pulled apart as well. The Victorian system is limping, but it'll fall over in the none too distant future. So it'll be pulled apart then. Very pragmatic when you work in this field. You just wait for the next disaster before something happens to change it. So the characteristics of a child-safe organisation, which you are legislatively now required to be, are that it creates conditions that reduce the likelihood of harm happening to children or young people. Because while I've talked a bit about what goes on in families, there are, in fact, we call them intrafamilial abuse, and then we call it institutional abuse. So the Royal Commission at the moment is looking at institutional abuse. It's not looking at intrafamilial abuse. And looking at institutional abuse has been something that Australia hasn't previously done. We haven't acknowledged that it's occurred. We've sort of acknowledged that children in their families may be abused, but we haven't talked about what happens in organisations. But we do need to keep in our mind that nexus, that children who have been abused at home, if there is somebody in your organisation who is looking at grooming a child, they will zero in on that kid like a bee to a flower, because that's a child who is vulnerable and who will be looking for somebody that they can trust, that they can form a relationship with. And so one of the things that we do need to do is to be mindful of that context. However, not all children who are abused in institutions are children that have already been abused in families. So the other thing that a child-safe organisation does is it creates conditions that increase the likelihood of the harm being discovered. And then the third thing it does is that it actually has a capacity to respond to the disclosure and the allegations and the suspicions. And one of the things when we come back after break that we talk about is, for teachers, the difference between actually having a suspicion that a child has been abused and so you're detecting, you're feeling it's not right, there's something going on here, and that's a decision that yes, something may have happened to this child. And then the other decision of, am I going to do anything about it? And in fact, teachers are showing in their behaviour that they're separating those two decisions. And part of the research that I want to talk about after the break is, why are people separating those two decisions? So the things, as I said, that are driving you are the Royal Commission into institutional responses to childhood sexual abuse and the recurrent failure of the state-based child protection systems. And part of, the new movement in child protection, and we've seen it from the introduction of mandatory reporting. And I talked earlier about the fact in my state the whole front end of our system is deluged because people think by reporting to child protection they've taken the action that they need to take, and so they report everything. But the child protection system itself doesn't have the resources to respond to that. So what's happening in now is that they're really beginning to talk about where the organisations are that deal with children in a whole range of ways and how that becomes a much bigger service delivery system. And that quite clearly is going to include schools in some way, form or means. And as I said, the last thing is obviously this changing awareness that we have of family violence. And, as I said, the Batty murder, I think, brought home to a lot of people that children get murdered by their parents. Having worked in the field now for many years, it is so common. And in fact, we have profiles of telling you, that can inform you about who might hold that risk, who will go over the top. And it's fascinating, the criminal profiling of violent people and what it tells us about their personalities and how they behave is really interesting. So they're the three things that are really pushing us. Now, are you going to wave a finger at me, Brian, when I need to stop and let people go? Who is going to wave at me? You're going to wave at me. Yes, I don't read the two. Thank you, okay. Okay, so... Your parliamentary inquiry, which was called the Betrayal of Trust, the inquiry into the handling of child abuse by religious and other organisations, you had that in about 2012, and it came up with basically 5 cohorts of recommendations, which is strengthening the criminal law to make it an offence to fail to report to police if there's been child abuse. And my understanding is that your government has agreed that all of the recommendations, and I think the original inquiry made 17 recommendations, all of them are going to be implemented. I think this one around the standards of practice is the first. So you are going to actually have legislation that actually says you have to report this to police. There's going to be easier access to civil litigation for victims, which is also an interesting thing that's coming out of the Royal Commission. So not only can you look at taking, can the state look at taking criminal charges, if in some fact somebody has seen to be negligent about not managing or not keeping somebody safe, then they will be able to be sued in the civil jurisdiction. And that's focusing the mind of a lot of organisation managers, that their organisations will now need to be transparent and clearly meeting sets of standards that say they are meeting, it's actually doing something about this. So there'll be new civil mechanisms. There'll be the establishment of an alternative avenue of justice. Because of the nature of trauma and the way that it affects people, the criminal justice system is an incredibly harsh way to try and resolve these. And it often comes down to one person's word against another. You don't have a judiciary that's particularly well educated or understands these issues. So at the moment, what's happening across Australia, they're looking at whether we need to have some other form of resolution within the court system. There'll be greater monitoring and scrutiny of organisations, which is the bit that you're experiencing with the new standards. And there'll be further prevention systems and processes. And those areas are activities that are occurring at the federal level at the moment. And there is some discussion about what should move to federal jurisdiction versus staying in state. And I said, I don't think that we'll have washed this one out for at least 10 or 20 years. So this is going to be keeping on coming. This is just the start of it. So your Victorian child safe standards. So these are the ones that as of the 1st of January, your organisations are going to have to comply with, and they're going to have to be fully compliant by the 1st of August. There will be mechanisms set up where they'll be reporting. Those are not clear yet. So many of the schools and the public education system or the various different other education systems are waiting to find what those mechanisms will be. But you will find your principals and the managers of your systems suddenly very interested in this area because they've got a pretty short timeline to actually bring this one through. The actual child safe standards say that the focus of the standards is helping organisations to drive cultural change so that protecting children from abuse is embedded in everyday thinking and practice. and that was the date that you actually became compliant. So the first standard is that there will be strategies to embed an organisation culture of child safety, including through effective leadership arrangements. And I'm going to come back to that whole issue of culture because one of the issues that we have with many organisations is, particularly when governments are driving a compliance framework through, is that you have sort of actions, like you have wonderful policies that are 5 and 6 pages long and printed up in all sorts of lovely glossy stuff. One of our problems that we've got is that we're actually knowing from research that many of the people who work in schools, or the parents or the children, actually have no idea what's in those policies. And if they do have an idea what's in the policies, they often don't understand the language. So part of what this whole child safe push is about is actually beginning to say, how do we begin to talk about these things in an understandable way that people can see in their daily life, that they can start working on? How do we bring that in? And so one of the things that your standards are recognising is that that's going to require leadership. And I think that's going to be incredibly challenging for some of your principals and some of your principals and state managers, partly because various different people come to this area with various baggage. Some people find it easier to deal with it. This is a thing where, as I said, you're making often Sophie's choice decisions about, two bad options, but it's also about those thresholds of when do we believe abuse or risk is there, when do we believe we need to take action. Who might this action hurt? And what might it do to staff if they feel like we're watching them? What might it do to parents if they feel like we're not looking after the kids? So both sides of the argument have got people who are going to be impacted on by decisions in the organisation. And so part of what's happening is that governments around Australia are recognising that this is about the culture of the organisation. What are we talking about in the organisations? What's normative? It's really interesting. The research is clearly showing that kids know an enormous amount about not running on wet cement. They certainly know that you shouldn't be running around swimming pools. They know a lot about what you're able to do in science labs, and you're not allowed to climb on this or that. But begin to talk to them about the safety of their own bodies and their own entities. And their teachers generally have not had conversations with them about what that means. And they don't understand it in the same way. So, when you take people out on sports excursions, I think you're probably organised to the hilt, you keep your eye on them, you're checking what's going on. We haven't got similar processes around the safety of children in our schools. The other thing is it's actually also asking you to look to the left and to the right of you at your own professional peers and say, what's going on here? Is this person behaving appropriately? We have a lot of cultural issues in Australia about you don't dob, you don't tell on people. One of the critical issues around faith-based organisations, and I actually had this discussion with an Anglican archbishop who said to me, the hardest thing for me to learn being a committed Christian was that I don't actually have the right to forgive somebody who's perpetrated sexual violence. That is not my right. Christianity says to me that I should forgive and that I should believe that people can change. And he says I still believe that. However, in this area, I don't have the right to adopt a belief that the person has changed or to actually forgive them for what they have done. If there is forgiveness to be issued, it is from the victim to issue it, not us. And so there are all sorts of cultural issues that run through in faith-based organisations that come into doctrinal areas, and they are extremely challenging. As I said, I think the Catholic Church is probably the one that's on the sort of the pointiest end of the stick in terms of teasing some of these out. But the Anglicans, in the community I live in, my son went to a school that has been all over the Royal Commission, the Hutchins School. which was a boys' school where there was a series of pedophiles that were abusing boys over several years. And the principal kept going to the board, and the board really wanted to deal with it as a risk management issue and didn't follow through on it. And again, those organisations, so there's a lot of cultural issues that we've got to deal with, and they're not going to be dealt with overnight. But that, in fact, is built into these standards, so they're going to have to be dealt with at some stage. So I was going to say I don't envy your job, but I'm really glad you have to do it, because I think it's going to be, it's moving us in the right direction. So a child safe policy or statement and a commitment to child safety, which I think certainly know at a national level you've certainly got some material like that. A code of conduct that establishes clear expectations for appropriate behaviour with children. And I'll come back to codes of conduct in a minute, because codes of conduct can either be a written document so that you can say I've got a code of conduct, or a code of conduct can belong to the people who have to work in it. And one of the issues that we've had, one of the big mistakes that we've had and we've seen perpetrated across Australia in organisations, is that the management of the organisations produce the code of conduct and impose it, as opposed to certainly they often can create a draft, but it's actually getting the people who are on the ground to own it. And a code of conduct needs to be understandable as much by the children as it is understood by the teachers and by the parents. So codes of conduct have got a lot of things around them that are interesting. So standard 4 is screening, supervision, training and other human resources practice that reduce the risk of child abuse by new and existing personnel. I'll come back to that in a minute when I begin to talk about registration. How are we going time-wise? Oh, goody, okay. So standard 6 is strategies to identify and reduce the risk of abuse, and I'm going to come back to that in more detail again, and strategies to promote the participation and empowerment of children. So one of the things, and that last one is actually built into the standards, and in each state there is an individual called the Children's Commissioner or the Children's Guardian, and they have, across Australia, and there is a national one as well, they have nationally collaborated to come up with a set of standards that they believe all organisations dealing with children need to behave with. And the big area that they're pushing is that organisations don't talk to the children that are in their organisations, and that they don't hear the children when the children talk to them. And so one of the cultural issues that we're going to be having to deal with in these sorts of things is, how do we hear a child when they're telling you that they are distressed? When in fact, if they are a traumatised child or they have withdrawn and they're sitting quietly in the corner, not socialising and whatever, how are we going to hear what's going on? How are we going to hear them when they haven't got the language to talk about their genitals and that somebody's been touching them, or to say that they've been seeing pictures of adults and animals doing things on the internet, that an uncle has showed them those sorts of pictures? How do you have that conversation with a child? And so one of the things that they're really talking about is, what do we need to do to actually help us feel okay about it? If I actually said to all of you, I want you to turn around to the person next to you and tell them about your most recent sexual experience, did the stress levels rise anywhere in the organisation? I've actually had a couple of people who, before I could actually ask that question, had jumped in and gone, yeah, well, let me tell you about it. But on the whole, when you ask that question and you think, oh, right, so you feel like that about, and I wasn't presuming your recent sexual experience was a traumatic one or a non-consensual one, but if you feel like that talking to the person next to you, who you probably know as well as, kids would know their teachers, how are they going to feel when you're wanting to have, how are they going to feel about that conversation? A lot of them are just not going to have it. So one of the issues that teachers will actually have to do is to learn to be an enabler in that, and you're going to have to deal with those feelings of stress as well when the children start talking about it, because a lot of what they will tell you will be pretty horrible, pretty horrible. So, pre-employment screening, which has been the traditional way that we've dealt with this. Many of you, I think in your state it's the green card that you've got to get before you can be employed in an organisation where there's children. And so essentially that's now being introduced pretty much in every jurisdiction across Australia. And it's a registration process which focuses on a criminal history check. But somewhat less than, I think it's about less than 3% of people who sexually abuse children are ever engaged with the criminal justice system. So the vast majority of people who abuse children don't even get into the criminal justice system. So that's one of the big failings that we've had with the pre-employment thing. Some of them, the more sophisticated ones, also involve a process for identifying whether the individuals have concerning attitudes and beliefs about children. So they actually go into some of the intrapsychic profile of the individual to say, are you suitable to work with kids? And I don't know how many of you, in terms of your application to university to qualify as a teacher, underwent any sort of psychological testing. I certainly didn't as a social worker, and I mean social workers get released into an incredible number of high-risk situations with high-risk individuals. So we don't know, and what's happened now is that the realisation that we have in fact created a whole lot of professions which we've treated within academic frameworks, but we actually haven't looked at what the personality profiles are, what the motivations are, what are people doing in those professions. And I should actually draw your attention to the fact that people who have predispositions to paedophilia are often attracted to professions or areas where they will be put into helping roles and where they will gain access to children. They are just attracted to those professions. And the research has clearly shown us that it's taken us up to now to actually say, well, we actually probably need to start looking at who's going into these professions and what's happening. And it's sort of a bit horrifying as well, because one of the things, and I don't know whether, and you might be able to inform me, but one of the trends we were looking at about 2 or 3 years ago was that there was an extraordinarily high level of reduction, or there was a rapidly reducing level of males working in primary schools and junior schools because of the fears of their behaviour and whatever, that we don't have the mechanisms to actually test people for predisposition. So it's actually affecting who's going into the profession and often biasing, if you like, the gender balance of who we've got working in our schools as well. So at the moment, one of the things that I guess we're looking for here is somebody, some psychologist somewhere, to come up with some reliable and valid tools that'll give us some sort of prediction about who is safe to work with kids and who isn't, but we haven't got it yet. So what we're really dealing with pre-employment screening is real limitations of available information and that lack of a tool, so we can't filter them out. We don't know at the moment who's going to pose a risk. But one of the things that we do need to know is that it's vital that screening doesn't lead to a false sense of security, that because we've screened people, everybody in this school is safe. And also to displace the focus that what we've got here is a population of safe people, as opposed to the fact that we have an open, intelligent culture that values the safety of children, and we are able to share the knowledge and the experience and talk about these hard issues in a way which actually keeps our kids safe. So we can't let it go there. So the prevention of abuse. The conventional approach to preventing child abuse has been to rely on those pre-employment checks. Now what's happening is that we're moving to a very different place, and we're looking at a proactive, multifaceted approach, which is where you're beginning to see your standards coming out of your government. So we're beginning to open that right up. But we're doing that in a way which is going to create organisational transparency, because that is one of the other things. I've got it on another slide here, but I'll say it anyway. The Royal Commission has found that the major reason that perpetrators of sexual violence and abuse against children within organisations have gotten away with it is that the organisations have developed internal processes of investigating and managing them. So one of the things that's happening at the moment now is that the state is stepping in and saying organisations can only go this far, and we will take over and work with you from there, and up to this point this is what we require you to do to a standard. So This is your brave new world that you're walking into in 2016. And they're the reasons that it has. When we look at I don't know whether any of you have been following closely the transcripts that have been coming out of the Royal Commission. The service that I ran was one of the services that was funded to deliver support to Royal Commission clients. But the people who were sexually abused in those organisations talk about the way that their disclosures were managed in the organisations as a worse and more traumatic experience than the original abuse. That they were disbelieved, that they felt bullied, that they felt threatened, devalued, cast out, and it's that history that we've got. The other thing that is sort of interesting is that because of the way that organisations deal with risk management, they often see it as about financial compensation, and certainly I think there are elements where financial compensation needs to be considered, in the sense that people often, if they've been sexually abused or physically abused in this manner, may need lifelong support and services that they'll have to pay for, and they need adequate resources to do that. But they actually say that's not the main thing. The main thing is actually the attitude of respect, of belief, and that people are going to help us resolve this. And it's quite interesting. I mean, one of the others, just beginning to be material coming out of the Royal Commission as well, about the degree to which victims of sexual abuse are seeking, if you like, vengeance against the perpetrators of the sexual abuse, and certainly some are, but a significant number of them actually see their perpetrators as victims in their own right. You know, and in fact, many of the perpetrators of sexual abuse in institutions have previously experienced abuse themselves, and that's part of what we're talking about. I probably at this stage just want to throw in one other thing that I'm not going to talk about a lot today, but you need to know, and it is coming at you and is already covered under your child protection legislation. It's actually the probably best performing state in Australia in this area, and that's children in schools displaying problem sexual behaviour and sexually abusive behaviour to other children. And this is a subscript that's occurring in the Royal Commission very quietly. It hasn't been on any of the telly shows, but there will be a report out about it. And when the Australian Crime Commission did their report into problem sexual behaviour and sexually abusive behaviour, they came out with a figure that somewhere between 40 to 70% of the sexual abuse of children occurred at the hands of other children and young people. Practice Wisdom, I did a major research project on this a couple of years ago. Practice Wisdom would tell us that it's in fact somewhere between 30 to 60%. So one of the critical issues again, and a lot of the work that we were doing with schools was around this issue of how do you deal with other children and peers that are being sexually abusive to children, and schools will have to begin to cope with this issue, and it is a really, really complex issue. So I'm just going to take that one and sit it there, but you will have opportunities to ask me questions, so I'm happy to come back because that is a particular area of research that I have been working on and I'm very interested in. So I just name that up as well. And one of the issues we're going to have in terms of that external accountability of schools is the degree to which you are able to cope with those sorts of problems and issues. So codes of conduct. So codes of conduct generally, which are what you are required to do under the standards, should not create a sterile environment in schools. I mean, I can remember a lot of the work I've done in terms of sexual abuse, in terms of intrafamilial sexual abuse, is to talk to parents about how do we know what is appropriate and inappropriate sexual behaviour. And one of the critical issues is, for instance, should a child have a bath with a parent? You know, should you get your clobber off and hop in the bath? Now, one of the issues that we've got is that many people now say you just don't do that because it could be seen as at risk. There could be allegations, something could happen about that. So we've got that sort of suspicion and fear about what is natural, normative, reasonable, okay sexual behaviour versus not okay sexual behaviour. And codes of conduct, as I said, one of the strategic failings of them is that they've been produced as business risk mitigation documents rather than documents that actually say to people, what are the problems if we're trying to look at these issues and we're trying to talk to people about them, and what are the boundaries? I mean, with the work that we were doing in Tasmania with schools around problem sexual behaviour and sexually abusive behaviour, teachers absolutely did not know what was normative and acceptable sexual behaviour by children by developmental age. Okay, so they just didn't know it. So there's a whole lot of conversations that we need to have, and our codes of conduct should reflect those. So, however, they also have to be business documents. So what we need to do is to look at those codes of conduct, identifying and helping people target the sorts of behaviours that are not acceptable in the organisation. And if we talk about perpetrators, a perpetrator, for instance, may single a child out for special attention, may communicate with a child privately, for instance, they might, by text or Facebook. Their physical behaviours could be intended to increase the child's acceptance of sexual touch. They do a lot of physical play with children. They're sorts of behaviours, and what we need to be able in our mind, and one of the dynamics that changes the way that teachers make these decisions about whether this is okay behaviour or not is whether they're a parent themselves. So if they're used to roughhousing with their kids, they will tend to accept it more in an organisation. So unmarried and non-parenting teachers actually have higher levels of reporting, identifying and reporting these issues than married parenting teachers. Just was an interesting one. And we haven't got any reason we don't know why, but we can only conjecture. It's because they've been grappling with those boundaries within their own parenting relationship, and there are transferences between them and an institution and what they see as acceptable or not. And you're supposed to be talking to each other. All right. Okay, just do these. I've only got another couple. So, codes of conduct. Should be noted that often perpetrators will not only groom a child, but they groom the adults around them by desensitising them to inappropriate behaviours, by slowly normalising their own behaviour. And the classic example of this was a young chap in the YMCA who, in fact, he's now in jail, but he sexually abused a number of children, but he'd gone through the Y and he would physically play with the children. He became the person who cared for the difficult children and whatever else. And what had happened was that all the adults around him, all the other staff around him, saw him as a helpful and useful and whatever person, and not one of them actually looked at the behaviour and took it out of context and thought about what's he doing here, what's happening here. And it's really horrible in some ways, because what you are being asked to do is to look at your colleagues with a different lens on your eyes. Because the reality of it is that there are people in organisations who are at risk of this behaviour.